Good evening and very warm welcome from all of us here at Pembroke. My name's Lynn Brindley and I'm the new master here from August. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome all of our friends, all of our robotics friends, and our biologists, our psychologists, and all of those who work between the boundaries. And those of you who are our alumni, our Pembroke Fellows, in the number of disciplines I think are here tonight, as well as we hope our sponsors who are delayed in the same way I think as I was delayed by some grim experiences on the railway system. But this is a rather a new style event for Pembroke, and in a minute I'm going to hand over to Ingmar Posner, who's organised this 3-day event and summit here. And he's going to say a few words about the sort of nature and the spirit of the whole of this summit meeting. He's then going to turn over the floor to Professor Alex Kacelnik, who is going to give us this evening's keynote lecture. I think at Pembroke we're rather excited here that these wonderful new facilities are enabling us to do new kinds of academic things and outreach things that we couldn't do before we had them. And we were really delighted and ready to move with an idea when one of our most generous benefactors of recent times, His Excellency Mahfouz bin Mahfouz, expressed an interest in seeing how he could support the college academically. You may have noticed walking here, if you came in a particular route, that Mahfouz, who is a foundation fellow of Pembroke, gave his name to the newly landscaped garden just at the bottom of the steps and leading up towards our bridge. His name is also affixed to one of our splendid new buildings in this new quad and complex. And this week he's generously supporting this event, designed, I think, to benefit the academic and research communities and college fellows here, and of course colleagues from elsewhere in the UK and from around the world. Pembroke researchers, I think too in other disciplines, have also played an active part in preparation for these proceedings. And indeed, some of you may wonder, if you don't know Alex, what is a distinguished animal biologist doing at this particular summit? Well, I'm not even going to try to answer that question, and I'm sure that Ingmar and then Alex will make it pretty clear why he's giving this lecture. I hope particularly our alumni guests tonight are going to take away a strong impression that Pembroke is doing some exciting things, and certainly in our interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary environment of college, that we can serve to inspire and innovate and help to develop new ideas and research programs. Alex, thank you for allowing us to film this lecture. It does mean that we can make it much more widely available to our alumni who are not able to be here tonight. Mahfouz sadly could not be with us tonight, but I think that William and his associate are due to be here, and they will be joining us a bit later. But can I extend my warmest gratitude of all of us at Pembroke to the sponsor of this Oxford Robotics Seminar and Summit, and this year's Mahfouz Forum at Pembroke, which we hope will be the first of its kind and more to come. Thank you very much, and I hand over now to Ingmar.
I was wondering how I would best introduce Alex, and the answer is I'm probably not going to so much because he's going to tell you much about what he does later. I first met Alex over lunch in a typical sort of Oxford sort of way when I first started here about 2 years ago, and we sat down next to each other, and I looked over and he looked over and I said, "Hi, I'm the new engineering fellow here. and he said, "Hi, I'm Alex." And I said, "Oh, what do you do?" And he goes, "Well, I'm interested in the use of tools in animals, or by animals." And I said, "Oh, that's really interesting, because I'm into robotics, and I'm really interested in kind of how robots interact with the world and sort of thing." And then there was a bit of a pause, and we looked at each other and we thought, okay, we could see something here, and that kind of led to a very interesting conversation about where commonalities lie, and the fact that I had no idea what birds were actually, and animals in general, were actually able to do, and some interesting conversations and questions by him about where we are at in the robotics world, and what we can actually do. That's a question we're still trying to answer, as it turns out. So out of that, we kind of agreed to meet. I don't know whether you remember this. We agreed to meet kind of on Mondays, kind of more regularly and see. And we only managed to do this about 3 or 4 times. And had these interesting conversations. And it turns out that at one of these lunchtime meetings, Hannah Smithson joined us as well. And this kind of thing went 3 ways, and we talked about this a lot. And then one day, we happened to sit next to the development director, Andrew Seaton over there. And the whole thing kind of took on a whole new shape, because Andrew spotted that blatantly there's something there, and wouldn't it be nice to have a forum where we could discuss these things? So that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is that 2 years ago, a man sitting over there somewhere, Ollie Brock, there you go. Hey. Ollie Brock organized what's known as back then it was called the Berlin Summit on Robotics, and it was kind of a somewhat unconventional way of holding a meeting, and I'll get to that in a second. But the point is, it was kind of due to happen again somewhere, and it's the first time in Berlin. So we kind of thought, well, the second time it would be quite nice to maybe do this in Oxford, and that would fit in really well. And this time, rather than just having it limited to robotics, we could broaden the scope and bring in a new impetus, a different perspective, really, by behavioral ecologists, by psychologists. To just kind of ground us in what we're doing to some degree, and kind of challenge us as to whether the problems that we're working on are actually in any way useful to them, and vice versa. So that was interesting. So I proposed that, and we kind of kicked that around, and it was a bit of a bumpy ride, particularly when Andrew Seaton said, "This sounds excellent. So what's it going to be like? So tell me about the talks. What are the talks going to be like?" And I said, "Well, they're not really going to be any talks." Okay. All right. Tell me about kind of the public lectures and things. And I said, "Well, they're not really going to be any public lectures." Okay. What about the program? Okay. There's not really going to be much of a program as such, at least not one that is cast in stone. And this is where I jump back to this kind of unconventional nature of this meeting. The spirit of this summit idea, and Ollie will correct me if I get this horribly wrong, but the spirit that I've kind of picked up from the original summit is, if you think about how academics work in terms of going to large conferences, one of the largest conferences in robotics are things like ICRA and IROS. Thousands and thousands of people go to these places. They're often 10-track, which means 10 often amazing things happen at once, right? You always get the feeling that you're missing something. And when you're not kind of missing a talk somewhere, you have to run somewhere else for some meeting on editorial boards and stuff like that. And you get to see your colleagues, true, but mainly in passing in corridors, and you say, that thing we talked about 2 years ago, we should do that. Okay, so the idea of the summit really is to get rid of all of that. Get rid of all distractions, get rid of all needs for talks, get rid of all meetings, get rid of all of it. Come to the summit, book people for 3 days, bring them into a room, get sofas. Yeah, that was another thing. So what about the layout? Where's this going to happen? Yeah, the Harold Lee room. What do you need? A bunch of big sofas and lots of coffee. Yeah, so get a bunch of sofas, put them all into a nice room, have them kind of talk, and to some degree, try and minimize the need for structure. So sit them in there, try and come up with a bunch of topics that are interesting a priori, so people know they've got some form of idea what we'll talk about. And half of it is completely unstructured, open debate, whatever people feel is important. And so far, I think that recipe worked really, really well. I think what we've seen in the past couple of days certainly is that the behavioral ecologists have a very keen audience in the roboticists, and to some degree, very much vice versa, I would hope. I mean, the guy sitting in the audience here will tell you a lot more about that as well. I've come to appreciate that roboticists are often composed of a whole bunch of people in a room that tend to be slightly frustrated when people come and show them videos of birds doing amazing things. And we wonder how we managed in 30 years of robotics not to really make much of a dent into that sort of thing, which actually is why that lecture title fits really, really well. So that's really the spirit of the summit. And again, at least in my book, and I know kind of I'm biased in this sense, but at least in my book, I would say that recipe so far has worked really, really well. And again, to kind of fit in and kind of wrap around the thing that Lynn just said, I think the sponsorship here has managed to do an absolutely amazing thing for us. And we're not even done yet. So I can't wait to see what the fallout of this is going to be. So that's great. So without further ado, Alex, would you like to come?
Thank you. Hello, thanks for coming. I'm going to start straight away. I could have introductions and things, but I'm going to cut because I know that I have more material than I will manage to fix to fit in 3/4 of an hour. I want to get on to some of the material because to some extent everything I want to say really speaks by itself when you see the animals doing their things. So my words in a sense are just an aggregate to what I hope the animals will demonstrate. So the goal of this talk is to bring to everybody, a little bit to my colleague engineers and roboticists that we have been discussing for a few days, but also for other people from general interest who are here, the notion of what are the problems we face when we try to understand the intelligent agents, either because we want to design them or because we want to somehow decode what is it that they do, how is it that they do what they do. Okay, and this, if you think of it, is very similar, just to give the thing again, to give the game away. When roboticists and biologists work on complex behavior, I'm going to very loosely call it wisdom, they deal with 3 different kinds of components. I'm going to make the lights a little darker here. I hope you don't doze off. That's better, isn't it? So, on one hand, we have what I call know-how by design. And this is what has been created either by evolution, by natural selection, through selection between generations, or because the engineer has put in the case of robotics. We have what the agent, I'm going to call it, to mix animals and machines, can learn by its own experience through different forms of learning. There are a bunch of different processes by which you can acquire information through your own experience. But then there is all the spooky rest. There are things that we find it very hard to deal with because when you look at it in animals, including humans, there are things that kind of exceed our current capability for modeling and simulating. Even some very simple things that we may do, like doing like this, is something that we've been discussing today. It's very hard for us to understand how you do it. And so I put all of those things, particularly those things that deal with innovations, in this kind of spooky kind of area that what our job is to try to modify by actually, well, let me give you a few examples of this first, before I move. So, you know, we all tend to use these machines and we think that this is a very specific kind of human adapted device. But in fact, there is a wider market. And when there is a market, there is indeed always a product. And here you have a machine used for games, and you have a player which is probably better than most of us at actually doing it. And now this is sold in tropical areas at a cheaper price to toads. So this kind of behavior, the toad in the film was not being stupid. Because you may ask, it's not catching any ants. But what happens? In nature, things that look like ants, what are? Generally, they are ants, right? Or bugs. And so the animal has a relatively rigid rule that natural selection has put in it, and that works on, I would say, more than 99% of the times, a lot of the time. But of course, you go to the laboratory, and the purpose of laboratories is to decouple nature into different parts so that you can analyze it and you can do things that don't happen in nature. And then you expose mechanisms, and that's the way you try to understand animals. So these complex things can also be done by machines. This is another example that the roboticists are familiar with. So I don't know if you're familiar, the roboticists are. This is something called Big Dog, and it's a robot that can, I'm going to lower the volume a little bit. Can do very clever things. Let me just advance a little bit because I want to show you. You see, it can carry weights for you. It can respond to disturbances in ways that the engineers have actually planned to some extent, but respond in an innovative way to things that have not been programmed in great detail. So this is also the kind of things that to some extent you can anticipate, and you do anticipate. There is uncertainty in the world, but you put it in the process by which your machine works. I'm going to cut this continues very nicely, but let me show. If you want to walk on ice, it is of course hard, but it manages, right? And so it contains all sorts of interesting feedback processes which allow it to recover from these kind of uncertainties. And so when we find these kind of things, in animals, or we want to put them in machines, we want to understand the processes. Now let me give an example of this. This is also something that we understand to some extent. And here what you see is a game of ping pong, if you want, or football, but it's played between pigeons. You see, this one gets fed because it did a goal, right?
Pigeon is reinforced for a cross-court shot if that is what gets the ball past his opponent.
So the point of this example the point of this example was to illustrate that you can get complex behavior from very simple processes. In this case, each pigeon is trained independently that if the ball falls on the other side, it will get food. And then you put two pigeons trained in the same way, and what results is a very dynamic game, something very complex, because the pigeons learn whatever they need to do, like shooting across or being surprising, not doing always the same thing because otherwise your opponent is waiting. They do all sorts of things that look very clever, but we understand the mechanisms as in learn by experience, and it's not too complicated. And then we have all these kinds of things. I mean, some of them appear very difficult, but are not. For example, when you want to fold a t-shirt, you do things which are quite difficult, but you can do it following rules. For example, here, I don't know if you've seen this. You probably can't, some of you may not be able to read this, but you don't need it to understand. So you follow some rules, and very quickly, you end up with this fully done. Now, this can be done in this rule-based approach that I just described, but it can also be done in a clever way. And this is a clever example of the same thing. more or less the same thing. What you have here is a robot facing a tea towel and having to fold it neatly. And it's actually thinking about it. What it's actually figuring out is what it has in front of it. And some of the robotics people around here have either authored this work or can at least explain it better than I can. But it's kind of figuring by the silhouette of the thing it sees with its camera what it's facing at the moment. And once it has a proper model of this, it goes out and can do it, and is, of course, very satisfied with the result. So, to change again. Okay, the whole thing is just to introduce the problem that the complexity of the task per se does not tell us immediately whether it's a difficult one or it's an easy one. You could do very difficult things by rules, you can put them together, the outcome is unpredictable. But some of the things we see are more difficult. And what we try to do in meetings like this, by the way, these are some credits given to the proper authors of all these things, and so that I don't run into copyright problems. But the task that we are facing here, jointly, mostly robotics engineers, but biologists and psychologists sitting together, is to change things from this, which is only spooky to us because of our current knowledge, and move it into the kind of things that we understand, with the goal that as time goes by, this thing is going to get smaller and smaller, and we'll start to understand more and more of what's going on. Now, this is when biology comes handy. George Williams made an extremely important contribution to biology through a very long life, but perhaps this kind of aphorism, this sentence, summarizes a lot of his many decades of contributions. He talked about psychology, about human psychology in particular, and he asked the question, very simple, is it not reasonable to anticipate that our understanding of the human mind would be aided greatly by knowing the purpose for which it was designed? Now, when we try to understand a robot, it's important for us to understand what is it that the engineers wanted to put in it, what kind of circumstances it anticipated. When we want to understand a mind, whether it's from a fruit fly or an earthworm or a human, we also want to understand what is the nervous system doing there? What is it for? Why did it evolve? And when we say what is it for, or we use the word designed, what we mean simply is how did it evolve by natural selection? And just paying attention to this brings a lot of facts of biology into our field. Another quote, and I'm more or less ending with quotes here, is that this also makes us think that different organisms have different requirements. And if we try to understand one species with the needs of another, then, of course, as Einstein said, we would actually live our whole lives believing that the organism is stupid. I thought that even Einstein deserved some correction, and I changed a little bit this. So again, no copyright problems because I changed a few words. And all I'm saying is that, you know, every species is doing the right thing from the point of view that what we see is the result of millions of years of being designed to do particular jobs. But if you judge any species by its ability to do whatever comes handy to another species, then of course you will believe that that organism is stupid. It's like seeing the toad at the beginning snapping at an ant and believing that he's stupid because he doesn't understand what we understand. Okay, let me give you, if you were thinking tonight to go home and read these three guys, I'm just going to give you all of them in one slide, right? And basically, the first guy there emphasized the fact that we are not general purpose machines when it comes to language. Basically, we can learn, we are adapted to learn, although he wouldn't like to be quoted in terms of adaptation and evolution. He never liked to mix that too much. But still, the idea is that we are specialized, dedicated machines to learn human languages. We know what data to look for, we anticipate some of the properties, and we are not a complete blank slate in order to do it. I think, of course, this is true, but on the other hand, it's insufficient, because we know that we are not pre-programmed for everything that we encounter in our lives. So we have some degree of dedicated constraints and some degree of generality. On the other hand, Skinner, not a friend of Chomsky's, was inclined much more to think about the organism as a blank slate. Try everything, and what works, you do it more often. Once again, this is something that is very powerful, but is also insufficient, because we know that organisms do lots of things that if we are stuck in the Skinnerian perspective, we actually don't get to make much progress about. Piaget, although this quote is from or not this quote, these kind of ideas were developed quite early, in the 50s, I believe 50s, early 60s, kind of had a more dynamic version of learning and said, well, okay, the information you can incorporate, you assimilate into whatever your own schema are, and your schema are modified in the process of acquiring information, and the dynamics between these two lead to some kind of equilibrium as you develop. And that seems to make a lot of sense, but on the other hand, it's as an idea, it's very good, but it's not that easy to apply and to implement either in a machine or to see how any particular organism does it. So again, we have examples that fit these sort of ideas, each one of them, but we have others that don't. And birdsong is a classic example where learning has importance and culture has importance, because the birds of many species, particularly of passerine, of what is called songbirds, tend to learn their songs from their parents, particularly in a vast majority of the cases from their fathers. Both the males and the females learn it from the fathers, because the females are not going to produce a song in many cases, but they have to recognize the song of their species, and the males have to produce it. So there is culture in birdsong. Different regions have different kinds within one species because of the drift produced by this process. But things happen that we don't understand. And this is one example. This bird is a bullfinch. And the bullfinch song in the wild is like this. It's extremely boring, right? Very simple. Now, if you take a bullfinch and you train it very carefully, then you can get it to sing like this. Right? So, let it finish. Okay. If the animal has this capability, but it doesn't use it because it learns only the simple song that its species produce, how did the capability evolve, and what is there for? Let me give another example of another male, because it illustrates a little bit of the sort of mechanistic problems that we understand. This animal starts quite well, but then it gets stuck. It can't remember the script very well. I like it better, actually. Haven't you been in trouble like this? You're giving a talk. So finally got it, right? But it's like it's stuck in part of the routine, and it loops through that, and it has to start from there in order to follow, right? So this is just one example that I find funny, but it poses serious problems to us. We don't understand why animals have capabilities that are not directly dedicated to solve the problems that we know they have in nature. And we are going to some more of those. Now, insight. Insight is a real problem. And I just want to discuss a few words about it, because I've written often as an enemy of the concept of insight, but it's very prevalent. People, researchers use it still extensively. But let me go to one very early description of the problem. This is work done in during the First World War. This is a chimpanzee that is placed in the presence of some bananas and a few boxes. And eventually, it manages to put boxes one on top of each other and reach the banana. And this is the description you find in a textbook, in a recent textbook, which is second order, a secondary quote of what Keller himself actually said. Look at the description. A chimp jumps fruitlessly at bananas that have been hung out of reach. After unsuccessful jumping, becomes angry or frustrated, walks away in disgust, pauses, then looks at the food in a reflective way, then at the toys in the enclosure, then back at the food, then at the toys again, and finally begins to use the toys to get at the food. To all appearances, and this is important, the chimps were solving the problem by cognitive trial and error, as if experimenting in their minds before manipulating the tools. The pattern of these behaviors, failure, pause, looking at the potential tools, and then the attempt, would seem to involve insight and planning, at least on the first occasion. Now, does it? All these words, which are very richly peppered through this description, are they necessary? Would we actually use them if we were seeing some other organism, not so much like us, doing something similar? And I want to show you an example to think about it. But the problems this raises is this. I'm going to illustrate it with an example. Well, how do we deal with what has been used as an explanatory tool, mental trial and error, trying in your mind? How do we deal with that experimentally? Is insight something that only humans can do, or perhaps humans and chimps? Are there alternative explanations for observations of this kind, which are simpler? And all of this is debated, but I want to show you some observation on this. And this is a pigeon that has been placed in a situation where, well, let me describe this first. It was first trained on separate sessions, either with pecking a banana, plastic little banana, because it's a kind of tongue-in-cheek take on Keller's earlier experiment. So he's pecking at a plastic banana and then he gets food, or he's pecking at a block in the floor by approaching the block to a green dot in the middle of the room, and then he gets food, or he's trained not to jump. Whenever the animal is jumped, then he has a period where the food is removed, right? And this is extinguished, one natural behavior. And then it's also been trained to stand on the food, on the block, and then it gets food. But one day, the animal is placed, there is no dot in the floor, there is a block, and there is a banana. And what does the pigeon do? And this is also a first encounter. The pigeon looks very angry and moves back and forth, meditating about it. It doesn't jump, of course. And after a little while, it tries something that it has worked before to some extent. And nothing happens, right? That behavior didn't work, but then he has other things in the repertoire, like pecking at it. It has worked in the past, right? But now it doesn't work. So keeps going back and forth, stands, still doesn't work. And now it gets the reward. Now, this pigeon is solving a very similar problem to the one that the chimp solved on a first encounter. It's novelty. And when this was published, it was in Science, in Nature, sorry, the first time, but then there were other things. I should say Epstein was the last graduate student of B.F. Skinner, so it's not surprising that he worked with that line of reasoning. What happens is that the animal is placed one day in a situation like the chimps, where it can't reach the food, but things it has been using for a long time in other contexts to good effect, like jumping on boxes or stretching or jumping in the case of the chimp, things like that, are all present in its mind, or it's in its behavioral repertoire, but don't work immediately. And then it starts doing different things. And the different things that it does is, I'm coming to that in a second, are very simple principles of the things that we know from many years of research work very reliably in the training of almost any animal, from fruit flies to rats or humans. And this is some principles. I'm not going to go through them, but basically by manipulations of reinforcement, you can get animals to get to do things, as we saw with the pigeons playing ping pong, that kind of thing. Some of these processes have the property of chaining, in the sense that doing one of the behaviors can produce situations that stimulate the next one. Like moving the block then creates a situation where you can try standing on the block and things of that sort, or standing on the block may allow you to peck at the pigeon. So all these things are just a few examples. You can incorporate many more laws, and you can refine the equations that you use. You can change the parameters, but you can explain a lot of behavior by these very simple processes. However, do these processes are they sufficient to explain the kind of things we see animals doing? So I'm going to move now to things which are more in the realm of what causes us real problems. You're familiar with some of the stories about chimpanzees using tools. I'm going to show you one in case you are not frequent watcher of nature films. This is a chimpanzee. You see that it has a very thin tool in its mouth. This is a termite mound, and it's going away now for a second into the jungle. And it comes back with a thicker branch, right? It uses the thicker branch to break the bark, the cortex, as it were, of this, and then goes to the thin one, which is flexible, and can put it in, and then starts eating the termites by getting the termites to walk on the thin twig. So this animal is combining one tool after another, is selecting which tool to use for each problem, and is solving a lot of problems, and we don't know how they do it, but one thing we do know is that the ability to do these things differs between regions. This is 6 different localities, and each of these boxes is one kind of behavior, and this is the sort of behaviors that are represented in the different localities. And some of them, for example, this one is actually present in this locality, and in that one, but not in some of the others, and so on. That leads people to believe that, the potential explanation is that there are no termites in one place and there are no tools or whatever. There are ecological differences. But that seems to be reliably excluded, and it appears that really is learning from each other, is a physical culture that actually allows them to do this kind of thing. Okay, this is as much as I want to do about chimps, because I want to show you that other species which are not normally suspect of being as clever as the chimps can do things which are also difficult to explain. And I'm moving now to one of our own research species, the New Caledonian crow. very conveniently lives in an island in the South Pacific that forces biologists to make sacrifices and leave the Oxford weather sometimes to go and work on them. And these animals use tools. They use sticks, for example, to poke into trees which have been half-eaten by larvae of beetles. They are extremely skilled. They provoke, they tease the larvae until the larvae bite, and then they pull. And I can tell you that that's very hard to do. I've done it. I don't have time, but I have movies there to show you. When I try to do it, it's like being a very good fisherman. You have to have exactly the right timing and the right tension, because otherwise the larva really lets go. So I couldn't do it in trying for quite some long time, but they do it very effectively. But what I want to show you today is what they do when you bring them to the lab. And this is just a few examples of things that these animals do in our laboratory. Let me show you one that some of you may have seen already. And this is an animal that has a straight wire and is trying to collect food from this basket. Right? And of course it can't. And then it jumps the tip of the wire in the soft tape, it pulls to the side, so that it makes a hook, and it collects the basket successfully with the hook. Now, this is discovered by the animal, no training involved. In none of the things I'm going to show you now, there is any specific training involved. We can discuss later how acquisition takes place. Now, you may think that animals might in nature break twigs by pulling from the distal side, and that what it's doing is not really trying to make a hook, although it's clever enough to use it, but actually maybe just doing that. So we did another trick, and we gave it a situation where the raw material could not be jammed. Maybe I have mail. And this is a little strip of aluminum, and look at what the animal does in this case. This is the 7th opportunity in which it gets this situation. It bends the proximal side, the business end, and it turns around this, and it's using the hook efficiently. So this means that there's something else other than just repeating mechanically some behavior that it may have acquired by natural selection. Now, this is interesting for what follows accidentally. I'll show you a couple of accidental things here. It can't get the food out of the basket this time. It's obviously stuck in the bottom. And it's taken to this upper platform, it's trying to collect it, and it doesn't work. It works for a while. But then it has a flash of imagination, and it remembers that it has a tool. It goes back to get it, and then it extracts the food. Once again, we would like robots that can do these kind of things, that remember what is around, where it left different things, and goes back when it needs appropriately. Now, again, this is quite similar in a sense. It has mechanical differences with the first example, but the animal still is making a hook. What if you give it the opposite problem? You give the animal a piece of metal which is bent already, and because of that is too short. So what you have to do to make it functional is to unbend it, right? And that seems a suitable control. And here you see exactly that problem. This is I'm sorry for the quality of the film, but look at this movement. The animal has never been seen before. In doing this movement that is going to come in slow motion in a minute, it actually stretched the strip of aluminum so that now it's just about able to reach the food. Now look at this. Oh, it's not yet. Getting it? But look at the movement in detail. Of course, it's very hard to prove that the animal has a perfect plan, a model of what it wants to achieve. But on the other hand, it's very hard to explain it by any other kind of form of words. Right? I have a lot of things to show you, but I want to skip through many. Let me show you this one because that's interesting. This is a small selection of the tricks. I'm going to stop for a second. I want to explain what the problem is. In this case, there is food here at the end of this tube. You are just not seeing the food. And there are these 4 tubes that contain instruments, a bit like rakes. In front of this tube, there is a short rake. Actually, the animal already has it in its beak in this moment. But of course, it's too short to reach this. But in this one, there is a long stick, a long rake, that is good enough to actually reach at the food. The problem is that we've been sufficiently devious to put this so deep in the tube that it cannot be reached either by the beak or even by the short stick. But in these tubes, there are intermediate length sticks that cannot be reached by the beak, but can be reached with the shortest of the 3 lengths of tools. So the solution to this, which in the laboratory we call the vice chancellor solution, because we put this problem once physically to the vice chancellor of the university, and he solved it. And really, without errors, actually, although it took some time, longer. But because of this, this is one example. Well, the animal, I should say that these are all trial unique problems. The crow is allowed to watch this from above for a while, and then it's allowed to come down and do its thing. So this is what it does. I'm going to go back to the beginning now that you understand what the problem is. You see that it looks at this, and it's sussing it up. It knows what is there now. It takes this. Sorry for the anthropomorphic language. I fall into that also when I know it's bad, but it's hard to do. Look at what it does with the short stick in a second. It throws it away, turns this around to have it in proper orientation. The rake. More male. Throws this, turns it around. Now it goes and gets the food, right? And in this case, there were 2 pieces of food. And the animal gets one and throws this away, and now it realizes there is something left. Now it picks back the same tool and uses it again. These are all trial unique tests, okay? So I better show you more. I could talk about this and the problems and how we try to understand it, but I better use my time this way. This is just, I'm not going to show you these videos unless there's extra time. This is just to show that they don't only use tools for extracting food. In this case, we put dangerous things like, for example, rubber snakes or rubber spiders in the cage, and what they do is they poke it at a distance with a stick to make sure that they can, and only after playing a little bit with that, then they dare approaching. So they use also tools for gaining information. Now, how do they acquire this? Let me give an example of an animal that has been reared in complete control of the circumstances in the laboratory. Some of the animals we reared without seeing anything at all. And other animals, when I mean anything at all, no sticks, no human or crow or anything doing any task. They've been otherwise lived in the same environment. And other crows were actually trained by the foster parent to use tools. And this is an example of how they were trained and what the crows naturally do. This is an animal which is only about 5 weeks old. I mean the one without the hat. This is Ben Kenward, one of our graduate students. And look, it's extracting food with a little stick, and the juvenile crow is actually following its movements, is holding to the tool. And they do roughly the same thing in the wild to parent crows, right? So they have the good opportunity to learn some of these things effectively. You see now he's playing with the stick that was left there, and is being clumsy, but it does it. So we thought that this kind of observation show that maybe they need this input to do it. They need to learn from it. However, there are always problems. Remember that we had some animals that didn't observe absolutely anything at all. And this is an example of day 65 of one crow exposed for the first time to a situation where it cannot get food by its beak. I'll show you in a minute. There's food between these blocks of wood inside, and the animal went and got a piece of stick which is completely useless when it has these good ones next to it. And it's trying, and it's very, very clumsy, but there's no question that it's got the idea that tools are a good thing. And no other species of bird would do this. You see, it's trying to use it somehow, to use the stick to solve this problem. And actually, in this case, it did get it. We'll see that in a second. But you see all these tools here? It's really cannot select. We put this here to make things easier for. And there it is. It got the food. And I think now you'll see it tries again. So, it's no question that these animals, without any training, have got a biological inclination acquired by design, as I described before, to use tools. And they actually improve with their own experience. But on the other hand, these animals learn from others, and the ones which have received demonstrations improve faster. The use of tools emerges at the same age, but the improvement, the tuning of the behavior increases faster when they have demonstrations. So here you have Chomsky, Skinner, and Pichette all in one slide or in one video clip, right? Because all the properties like preparedness for different tasks and tuning by reinforcement and changing of your own schema as you learn, all of them are represented in this. And presumably when we want to do clever robots, we'll have to do things of this kind. Now, I'm going to skip this one. I want to show you one or two more things, and so I'm going to skip to show you things which are more different. Sometimes we compare different species. And this is one case when we're trying to see, if you ask, people ask all the time, is a crow more intelligent than a pigeon, or is a dog more intelligent than a cat, or things of that kind. So how would you answer this question? You run the risk that Einstein pointed out that actually it's like asking whether a fish is good for climbing trees. So they are designed to do different things. But what you can do, if you think that there is a chance at least, or something like a general ability to solve logical problems that actually transcends the dedicated mechanism for solving things that the great engineer, natural selection, has anticipated, then if you give a battery of different tasks and you try to see how many different tasks this organism can solve, then you can start to make some progress in that direction. So we decided to compare the New Caledonian crows that we know are very smart, with the keas that other people have studied for a long time. This is a parrot from New Zealand, and also are known for being very smart in many different ways. And we did the following experiment. We created a box like this, which we call a multi-activity box. You can remove the walls. You can see here disassembled. And there is food in a little pedestal in the middle, some appropriate piece of food, a nut for the keas and some piece of meat for the crows. But then you can reach it in 4 different ways. One of them is by poking a stick that dislodges the food and then the food falls out. The other is by pulling from a string. The other is by dropping a marble through this chute. So here you see it, and then dislodges the food and comes out. And the other is simply by opening a window. You see the window here, and then reaching for the food. And the design of the experiment was that they can do it in any way they want, but whenever they reach a competence criterion for one task, whichever one they prefer, then we close it. And we see how long they take to solve the problem in one of the other 3 forms. When they reach competence in the other, we block that one, and we wait, and we see how long it takes, and so on. So that at the end, we can actually ask, can they solve all the tasks, and how efficiently? And this is not, remember, this is not in the order of solution, because the order was determined by individual birds. But this is in order of tasks. This is a New Caledonian crow facing the task at the beginning, and pulling a string is no problem at all. It doesn't take any time other than the time for actually consuming the task. For the keas, exactly the same happens. It looks around, it gets the food. It doesn't take any thinking time to do it. But now the ball task. Remember that these animals have not been trained in any form. And this is a kea. And gets the food. And now the stick. This is interesting because keas don't use sticks in the wild. The New Caledonian crow has no difficulty whatsoever, and that's not surprising. But the kea, and this to me is the most interesting part of this, to me gives me clearly the notion that it knows what it's trying to do, but it cannot do it because of ergonomic reasons. Its beak is not appropriate for holding a stick straight. And it has great difficulties using the hand and the beak for a behavior that gives all the impression of being planned. And it finally solves it. Now you look at opening the window. That's the easiest of all tasks. But a New Caledonian crow cannot do it. Well, this is the only one who did it, and you can see how difficult it found it. All the other things are blocked by now. When it manages to open it, it still won't get the food directly, but it picks up a stick, pushes the food, and goes and collects it on the other side. But when you look at a kea, which you'll do in a second, the kea picks up the window, opens, gets the food, and doesn't think twice about it. So what's the point of this? The point is that I'm not going to go through the data in detail, but I'll tell you the summary of what the data show. What the data show is that the New Caledonian crows are better than the kea at solving the stick problem. They are worse than the kea at solving all the other problems. It also shows the red is the keas, the blue is the New Caledonian crows, and this is 2 different measures of learning. You can see that the keas acquire tasks, master tasks, and discover tasks faster than the New Caledonian crows. They all end up doing it. You see here red and blue showing a crossing over. This is between the ball and the stick. And that's interesting because the ball is in some sense a tool. It's using an object to act on other objects. But the Keas don't use tools in nature, and nevertheless managed to solve this problem when it didn't pose this difficult mechanical manipulation problem. So I'm not going to go through that, but we can discuss it later. What I want to discuss is why are the species different. First, the Kea are more neophilic. This means they like new things and they explore things, while the crows are shy and tend to look things from a distance for a while when you introduce them. That makes things easy for the Kea, but that doesn't make them more intelligent. Then the Kea mostly explore things in a tactile form, touching with their beak or their feet, while the New Caledonian crows tend to do things visually. And there are many things that are very hard to discover by one modality or the other, and that doesn't make you more intelligent. Then, of course, there is a problem that is, in fact, an artifact of our study, because we used the animals we had, and this is that in this case, the Kea we had were captive reared, while the New Caledonian crows had been caught in the wild. So let's not discuss this, but that's a recognized weakness of our study. But then there is the ergonomic difficulties. The Kea are good at certain things, but cannot hold the stick straight because of the bill. And the crows are evolved to hold things straight. So that doesn't make you more intelligent, or less. And then the motivation. The crows are natural tool users, and as we've seen with the ones raised in captivity, they tend to use tools for whatever. You have a problem, let me go for a tool, right? And even if I don't know how I'm going to use it, there is a problem, I go for a tool, right? Tools are the ways to solve problems. Keas are not like that, because they have this very high ability to manipulate things with their feet and beaks and tongues, and parrots are particularly strong in that. And this gives you another advantage. And then is the last one. Are Keas more intelligent than crows or less? Well, I'm not saying that all species are equally smart. I raised the issue that some species can solve a much wider domain of problems than others, and that's more or less what we would call intelligence. But it's very hard to quantify. It's a really difficult task. And the same is true for, I'm sure it's true, but we could discuss that, for machines that you design. They can be good for one thing, they would be completely useless for solving other problems. Now, this is a golfing cockatoo, a white cockatoo that is trying to reach this object, and uncharacteristically for its species, nobody else has done it before, it actually cuts a splinter out of this beam and uses it to reach out for it. And I should say that the way we discovered this, completely accidentally, was that this animal was playing with a stone for no reason whatsoever. The stone fell out of reach, and then it did this trick to get at the stone. And then immediately we ran for our camera, and instead of putting a stone, we put a nut, and immediately the animal started doing this. Now I'm going to cut here. This is a case where it makes something which is too long, and then it cuts it so that it becomes appropriate for the length it needs. Right? Well, let's see this. So I think it's just this part of the clip. I should say that he lives with 14 other cockatoos that didn't do it. This one is called Figaro. And you see that the tool is bad, it's too long. Now what it does, it gives its back to the nut, it goes elsewhere, and starts working on this. And then it comes back, and it has already cut it, so that now is of a more appropriate length. Now, we have many examples of this nature. But I want to point out one piece of data only, particularly for things that we discussed in the workshop. This is the time it took to make the tool for the first time. These are trial numbers. And this is to use the tool. And what you can see is from the first time ever, the use of the tool was already minimal and didn't improve much. Of course, it's touching a floor. It's the minimum it takes you to actually do it. But the making of the tool took 25 minutes the first time, but the second time, it's already reaching an asymptote where the animal basically knows what it's doing. There may be a small trend, but it's actually basically has cracked the problem and is now executing it, right? So this form of learning, unfortunately, I'm limited. I wanted to show you this as well, but I'm going to skip through because I'm going into the drinks time, but I'm going to show you the data for this. This is the same picture for how these cockatoos learn to solve a sequence of 5 different devices that are blocking its access to food. Once again, a lot of time on the first task, but then immediately afterwards, the broken line is the average of different tasks, different devices. And you can see that it declines slowly, but basically there's a big discontinuity there. And that's the time when the animal discovers what the problem is. So let me summarize now. Intelligence first. We have big brains. Birds are supposed to have small brains, but you have to be careful about that. If you plot the brain weight and the body weight of different species on a double logarithmic scale, what you find is that if you are bigger, you have a bigger brain, which is perhaps not too surprising, right? But if you look at mammals, is this polygon here, and you look at birds, which is this one here, you see that they are more or less one on top of each other. The sizes of brain relative to their body size is more or less the same as it is for mammals. No big difference there. But if you look at the shape of that, and you ask who has the biggest brains, well, it's the blue whale, the elephant have the biggest brains. But this little kink here is the position of the maximum, as it's called technically, the residual of that regression. It's the maximum deviation from what you expect to have for a given size. And this is where humans stand, right? Now, if you look at birds, there is this kink here, right? And this is the point of maximum deviation from the expected size for birds. And who is there? The parrots and the crows, right? So they are particularly specialized groups of animals within their general taxon. It remains to be seen whether the lamprey that lives here is a genius among lamprey, really. But that really hasn't been examined yet in great detail. Now, just to show, this is a New Caledonian crow brain, and the New Caledonian crow is about 1/4 kilogram, and this is a domestic pigeon brain, and the pigeon is about twice as big as a New Caledonian crow. But its brain is about 1/3 of the size. I'm not going to go into the details, but the bits that make the crow brain big are the telencephalon, particularly, compared with the telencephalon of a pigeon. So it's the naughty bits of the brain, the really good ones, that are particularly exaggerated in the crow family. So this means that we might expect difference in general intelligence between these species, although demonstrating them is really tough, as I described. So some final thoughts. We know about this. We still don't know when your robots will do these kind of things. We don't know much about what is it that they are using to solve these difficult problems that to us, when we do it, we explain it to ourselves as having thought about it, reasoned, and cracked the problem. But there are many experiments that show that the narratives we build to ourselves are not the right story. when we tell how we solve a certain problems, sometimes we can collect data in the laboratory that show that that's not the way the people did it, really. But that's something that satisfies their need for a conscious account of what they have done. So we still have to solve the problem for other organisms, for humans, and for robots. Finishing to a few sentences. Again, Einstein, he said long ago that he fears that technology may one day surpass human interaction, and the world would be then a generation of idiots. A very eminent mathematician, John von Neumann, said the same thing, but created an important word that if you Google it, it will have many more quotes than for the whole of robotics and animal behavior science together. And this is the idea of a singularity, a point in the history of the human race when robots are going to be so smart that are going to start producing other intelligent robots. The thing is going to run out of control, and we are going to be completely dominated by them. Do I believe this is possible? Is there any danger of this happening soon? Well, my real answer to this is summarized in my conclusion. It's not going to be the robots, you know. So, in finishing here, there are many, many people, I'm not going to thank them individually, have helped to the stuff that I've shown and I haven't shown, but helped me thinking through everything I do. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. Out of interest, that conclusion that you reached, is the bird stupid? Did you get that after the past 2 days?
No, it's a comma there. That comma is very meaningful.
All right, there's some time for questions.
Yes, there's one here, sorry.
You showed several examples of learning words. So they are either like individual learning or it's hereditary learning from the parent or from the teacher. Do these species also show something of social intelligence? Like one of the crows is learning tool making, doesn't go and tell other crows that I learned how to make tools. So the social intelligence also come about in these species.
Yeah, I don't know if you all heard the question. The idea is this, I focus on examples of individual problem solving and intelligence. Do they also have particularly good ability for social effects? Now, and one of the side of the questions which I can answer is about, do they go and teach others when they've learned it? No, they don't. But do others learn when they see someone doing it? The answer is yes. So we don't have evidence for pedagogy. We don't have evidence of the crows actively intending to do things so as to instruct others. And that's a tricky one that many people claim is one of the few things that remain quite specially human. But of course, we've thought this before of tool use and many other things, so it's going to fall through eventually. But it hasn't been shown in other species. But learning from others, yes, is very widespread. There was one question there.
I was wondering, this might be hard to do ethically without hurting the birds, obviously, which you love. But is there any work done on modifying, say, the beak of a kea to be more like that of a crow, or even perhaps temporarily with some
Don't even go there.
Wasn't going there on a permanent basis, but some sort of temporary modification to make the kea able to hold the stick outright. Is there any work?
Let me tell you what we know about this. It's not much, really. We know that the New Caledonian crows are different from all other crows we know in having a particularly straight beak. And that means that they have morphologically evolved in relation to their natural tendency to use tools in the wild. So they are particularly good. Also, their eyes have adjusted retinas and fields of focusing ability that has to do with the fact that they are not looking only at the tip of the beak, but they are looking at a greater distance. So they have morphological things that have evolved in relation to tools. Keas are generalists, and I tell you that the beak of a Kea is extremely good for most things that you might want to do. If, for example, a good thief takes one of these bent things, I forget how they are called, but because I haven't done it for a while. But so they go with these things, and a good tool actually you can use for lots and lots of different things, and it doesn't take more than having an angle and certain properties. And the beak of a parrot is very much like that. So they don't in nature encounter many things where a tool will be better than your own beak and foot. And we think that's the reason that tool use is not so widespread. So you manage the questions or whatever? Yeah.
Developing the thought about birds learning by observing, by trial and error, has that taught us anything about the way that robots will be designed in the future? Is it going to change the way that robots develop?
Okay, I'll tell you only the bit I know, and then I'll ask one of the roboticists here to answer. What we know is that learning by demonstration can take many different forms, some more interesting than others. For example, you could simply learn to go where others are, right? If you see other bird, go there, and it's likely something interesting happen. And that would allow you to individually discover what's going on. The next step is that you may go wherever you see others being successful. So you wouldn't go if you see a stuffed bird, but you go if you see a bird that is actually doing something. That's called local enhancement. Or you may simply be inclined to look at the things that others are touching. And that's called stimulus enhancement. And that means that you start paying attention to parts of the world that are interesting to you because others are using it. And again, you may be selective and only look at the things that someone who is particularly efficient in your social group, like your meaningful adult or a dominant bird or someone in the flock, and so you don't copy everybody, you copy the one. And then there is imitation, where you actually do, with a part of the body that may or may not be visible to you, what the other is doing. And there's the whole story about mirror neurons and things like that some people have heard about that actually allow you, in theory, to model what the other is doing by actually reproducing in your own brain the same pattern of activity, and you could use that to learn. Now, in that whole range, all the spectrum has been seen for one task or another. And again, this seems to be a wide repertoire of things that happen through the animal world. And what roboticists actually do in this sense, I don't know at all. And so maybe someone wants to comment on this. Has learning by demonstration, by copying, been incorporated into some interesting robots?
Yes. So there has certainly been attempts to copy by demonstration, and of course reinforcement learning, which originally came from emulating animal behavior, is a central mathematical idea that's used in robots. So there, and then
yes, by seeing other robot doing it or a human doing it.
Well, a lot of it is by mental trial instances. You try out a lot of things and then eventually select something that seems to lead to high reward and then try to do that. So there's a lot of interest in different forms of learning in robots, whether they're identical to the animals.
No, sure.
But they're certainly.
But surely one thing that one could say at this stage is that, with robots we are playing God, which we can't with animals, so we can design them. And there is no reason why some roboticists could not start playing with the idea of imitation in some of the ways that are known to be useful for animals, and so these kind of things can be incorporated. Maybe the next grant. Do you have time for more questions?
I think we take one more, all right? Yeah.
Any more questions?
A brief general question. It strikes me that you study very smart animals in most of what you do. Is there anything to be learned from the really stupid ones?
I talked today about animals that spoke to the problem that we are discussing in this workshop. I also work with animals that I would not at all call stupid, but have a much bigger chunk than these ones in what natural selection has actually instructed you to do. Animals that actually are very, very clever at doing things that none of these could do, but are not that flexible, because they do extraordinary things, but they do very specialized kind of things, and that would be another talk. But now, stupid animals. Maybe if you think of an animal that has a very small number of neurons, like a tiny worm, like a nematode worm or something like this, from our perspective, it would really have a few behaviors. They do have learning, for example. They can actually, to some extent, change the frequency of behaviors according to reinforcement. But they can't do that much more. They don't use tools, and they don't do some of the things these animals do. So whether you want to call them stupid, poor things. For example, an animal that originates on an ancestor which is free living and becomes a parasite, starts living in a gut of some other organism, starts losing functions. It loses vision, because it's a bother to have eyes when you're living in a gut, right? It's no particular advantage. So you don't want to see what is there. And they also start losing nervous system, and evolutionarily speaking, right? And they become what, from a structural point of view, an engineering point of view, is a simpler thing. It evolves not to be more complex. It evolves to be more simple, only from the point of view of its design as a thing. But on the other hand, it's much better adapted. So is this animal becoming stupider? Well, it's actually less capable of major intellectual tasks like a free living nematode is. But on the other hand, it's doing much better in what it's designed to do. So your question is not unfair, because I refer to kind of general intelligence and ability to, and yes, these animals, this goes up and down in evolution, because sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing for you, or at least not a bad thing, but it's too costly and it doesn't give you benefits. So there's no point in having all the machinery for that if you are basically in a very predictable environment.
All right. Just before we finish, let me ask an unfair question, maybe to the roboticists in the room. How long do you think it'll be to answer Alex's question when we get our robots to do these things? Okay. Right.
A vote?
We better go back upstairs and talk some more. I'm clearly we need to. Okay. Great. Alex, thank you very much.
Thank you.